Hi, I'm Rowan.
Hey.
What's an ox goad?
An ox goad. Yeah, it's literally like a tool. We don't know what it would have been made of, but it's like you goad an ox. So you're trying to get an ox in the right direction, so you're just poking at an ox with this stick. Might be made of bone or wood or something like that. But yeah, literally something that you would use to like steer an ox around. So
it's like a pointy stick.
And Shamgar was good with an ox goad, apparently. So I don't know that much about farming implements, but that's the extent of my knowledge.
That's a good explanation. So what is the role of the church today then to try to guide us with this moral compass? Or is that something more of a community that we're looking for?
Well, I think the reason that, like I said last week, the reason that we want to engage with these stories is so that we understand where the story of Jesus comes from and where our morality has evolved from. We're not trying to say our moral compass should be guided by like the stories of the conquest of Canaan and all the Israelite people. What we're trying to say is over time, sense of people, sense of purpose, sense of welcome, sense of inclusion is growing and it's building throughout the human story. And my argument is that God has been there all the way along, wherever these tribal communities are at, saying, okay, what's the next step? How do we get you there? And then as soon as we land there, it's like, what's the next step? How do we move you there? And I think that's the kind of graciousness that I would hope that God has for us as a community and for me in my personal life. That there are things that I don't see right now, ways that I still scapegoat people, ways that I still exclude people. And there's ways that I've changed my theology as I become aware of those things. But God was with me all the way back 10, 20 years ago, and moving me to the next step. Who are you going to welcome in now? What's that going to look like? And then as soon as you get that done, you have to start looking for what's coming next. So for me, it's not okay, well, because of that, here's the application and now we're done with it. It's embracing this idea that God is constantly moving us forward back to God's heart. And we have to be willing to look at our own stories and see what's next the same way that the Israelite people were willing to do that as well all the way along through the story. Because again, the whole point of the conquest is we don't want to be contaminated by these other nations. And then God comes along and says, actually, you should welcome the foreigner as your native born. Expand your story in new ways. So how is God calling me to do that today? I know it's happened to me in the last 10 years, and I know I have more to go on the other end of it. Bobby?
When I have an encounter with these texts, even just tonight, re-experiencing the story of Jael was thrilling for me. And I loved Jer's point about no, we don't try to literally follow in Jael's very violent footsteps. We're a pretty non-violent community, in fact. But what that story does for me is it speaks to times in my life when I haven't known liberation. And in that story, there is this woman facing an abuser, a violent man, a man of war. And absolutely, I think there's some humor in it. She finds liberation and passes liberation on. And it's kind of like watching a horror movie and the thrill of the person who's sort of being tormented, finding their way through the torment. To me, I feel the story in my body. So what that says to me is it's not giving me 3 points on how to defeat my enemies with a peg through their temple, but it's giving me this imaginative story, what it feels like in my body to maybe imagine liberation or to speak liberation back. So we often read these stories as people who are the victors. We have tremendous privilege, and we don't always read it from this place of what is it really like to long for liberation, generation after generation, so that when you hear a story like this, it's over the top toward liberation, but in the language of its time, I still think it had this potential to draw people to what would it feel like to be free of these enemies? So it's really complicated to interact with them. They're very, very old stories, but they still speak to me about the longing for liberation and what it could be like to imagine it through the lens of Christ in a nonviolent way. And that is hard work, but it's really also fun.
And even for us, like you said, we're in a lot of privilege. I mean, Jael and Hebner are on the side of Jabin. And so she's working for this group that's against him. I mean, for those of us who are in positions of a lot of privilege, how do we take up that fight for the people who are being oppressed on the other side of it? That's good stuff.